Hey there everyone, I'm going to show you how to install FreeBSD 14 inside of a Proxmox 8 environment. But before we do that, I'm just going to go over a couple basics in Proxmox so everybody kind of has a bearing in terms of where I'm starting. So a couple things you want to have in place. Obviously, Proxmox needs to be built onto the host. A couple other things you'll need in place is sufficient storage. So in this case, I'll show kind of how to create a volume so you can see that. And then you also have to have the FreeBSD 14 ISO that's loaded into Proxmox so you can install the operating system, of course. And then you also want to make sure the network is effectively set up to be able to carry the traffic for FreeBSD as well. So we'll go ahead and go over the storage first. So if I go, Proxmox has two different areas. They have a data center area, and then they also have a standard viewable host per host area here. Now we're going to start out in the partner PV01 host, which is the name of the host. I'm going to go down to disks. Okay. Now when you do that, it's going to show all the disks that you effectively have in the system. And then if you go down, you'll notice there's an option for ZFS here. Okay. So what I want to do in this case is I want to create a new ZFS. And you'll notice here I left two drives. These are physical raw drives. These have no file systems on them whatsoever. They're ready to be provisioned as a ZFS mirror. So I'm going to go ahead and mirror these. I'm going to select both of those. I'm going to go ahead and call this FreeBSD backed. And then up here, I'm going to go ahead and select mirror. I'm going to keep the compression, and then I'm also going to make sure the A shift stays at 12. Okay. Then I'll hit create. Very easy process. Proxmox goes in, creates that ZFS. And you'll notice here, it's now built. And if I go in, it'll give me a little bit of information here. It'll tell me that I have a mirror and both the disks are indeed online and that ZFS set is ready to go. Okay, so we've got the storage. Now on the network side, pretty straightforward as well. If you go to the host area here, you go to network, you're going to notice that you're going to have several different network interfaces, and then you're also going to have a standard bridge. So when you install Proxmox, you always have VMBR0, okay? And that's going to be associated with the network, the management network that you're connecting to and through Proxmox. In this case, I want to use multiple different VLANs. So now how do I do that? You would have a trunked VLAN interface, and then you would be able to pass those tags through that interface, okay? So in this case, if you look at the bridge I created here with VMBR1, you'll notice here I just call it a trunk port, and I have this network interface that's associated with it. And you'll notice up here I've got VLAN aware selected. Okay, so now what I can do with this is I can basically pin this to any VM or container, and then I can pass those VLAN tags through to allow it to communicate on those specific VLANs. And I'll show that as I go through the FreeBSD install. Okay. So we've got the storage, we've got the network piece out of the way. And now what we want to do is we want to get the ISO up in here. Okay, so if we go back to the partner standard host and we go down to local, okay, this is going to be the default storage that's installed when you install Proxmox. You'll notice here there's an area for ISO images. All right, so we'll select that, and you'll notice I have a couple in here already. I'm going to go ahead and upload that from my local file system. In this case, there's my FreeBSD 14 release right there, that ISO. I'm going to go ahead and upload that. You'll notice fairly quick, pulls it in. Give it just a second to do that. And that's looking good. And you can see here now it shows the FreeBSD 14 release in here. Now, one thing I was going to add, if you want to go ahead and do that from download from URL, that'll pull it directly off of the web, right? So if you select that, and then I go up here onto this FreeBSD release page, and then I right-click on the ISO that I want. We do a copy link address, and then we go back over to this host. I can go ahead and paste that in here, and I can query that URL, and it's actually going to show the release ISO there, and I can download that as I go into Proxmox, and then I'll put it in there for install. But in any case, right now I've got the standard ISO in, so I'm ready to actually conduct the install. We're going to go and go back to the partner PV01, which is a standard host. I'm going to go up to create VM, okay? Now what this does, it starts a dialog, and it's kind of like a stepped wizard process. It asks you some questions, and then by the time you're done, you'll be able to actually execute the FreeBSD install to get started. So in this case, I'm just going to call it FreeBSD test. Okay, and then I'm going to keep all these options default here. Now you can put tags in here. This allows you, if you have tons of VMs and you need to do quick searches on a specific type, you can put tags in here and it allows you to locate them very quickly. Okay. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to leave all this default. You'll see here the VM ID of 102 is just what it does is it increments each individual VM as you install those. Shows you the standard host that it's on. In this case, I don't have a clustered setup here, so it's not going to present me with multiple hosts. It's just going to show this one. I'm going to go ahead and go next. And then you look here and you can select that FreeBSD ISO for install. Now, under guest OS, we do want to select other here, and that's for any type of Unix variant, that's the default option that you want to select. And then as we go into system here, you'll notice there's several different options. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I don't necessarily like the default graphics option because it gives me a real large screen, and it's hard to see everything. If you're scrolling through, and I want the fonts to be just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and select the VirtIO GPU, which it has a driver in there for. And then for machine type, I'm going to select Q35. Now, what's the difference between Q35 versus i440FX? i440FX is an older compatibility chipset that Proxmox uses, which I think was around the Pentium Pro era. And that one is used if you're using like standard BIOS or you just want the utmost level of compatibility and legacy compatibility. That's the one you want to select. In this case, I want to do UFEI. So if I do UFEI, I want to make sure I'm using Q35. And then I'm going to go down and select OVMF, which is the UFEI BIOS. Okay. Now what that does when you do that is it brings up additional storage options for the EFI storage partition itself. I'm going to go ahead and put that on the NVMe set that I have here. This is my local ZFS that Proxmox run on, and I'm not going to enroll any keys right now. And then under storage controller, I'm going to go and keep the VirtIO SCSI single SCSI controller. Okay, now FreeBSD has options for all of the VirtIO drivers. I'll explain one deficiency that's very easy to fix, but for the most part, everything works out of the box. And you want this because it actually gives you significant performance increase over the standard legacy drivers. But in any case, if you have to go in and select something that's a little bit older, just for compatibility, you can select one of the older LSI controllers or a Mega RAID controller, or in some cases a VMware para-virtualized SCSI driver will work as well. So we'll select that. Now we do want to click the QEMU agent box here, and what that basically does, it instructs Proxmox to try to communicate with the FreeBSD host after it's installed with the QEMU on the QEMU port, and then that will then provide kind of a socket into the FreeBSD installation that tells it certain things. Like if there's a shutdown command, it's gonna initiate a graceful shutdown through the agent. And what that basically ensures is that if you have to reboot the Proxmox host and you have a bunch of VMs on there, you don't want one that's gonna hang and it's not gonna be able to send those proper ACPI shutdown commands and so forth. So that's what the QEMU agent affords you, in addition to telemetry, where Proxmox then reports things like the MAC addresses, the interface names, and these sort of things, and I can show that in a second. I'm not using any TPM. I don't have a TPM module in this, so we'll skip through that. And we'll go ahead and do next. So in this case, with the disks, we have several different options here. BSD supports all of these. The IDE is considered kind of the compatibility bus interface driver, and we don't want to use that one just because of performance reasons. What we do want to do is select the VirtIO block, which is consistent with the rest of the VirtIO drivers I was talking about previously. And then we want to make sure that we select that FreeBSD backed storage device here that we created in that first initial step. And then I'm just going to make sure we're doing a 32 gig standard default option here. I'm not doing anything fancy with this OS other than showing an install, so I'll keep it there. I don't want to do any specific caching. We'll just keep that default, but you do have options to write back and write through and these sort of things. And then I'm going to keep everything else default here. We'll hit next. Now this pretty straightforward. You just put how many sockets or CPUs cores you want in here. In this case, I'm going to select 2 cores. Now the processor type, you can use a couple different options here. You can use all these are pretty much emulated, but what I like is you can go down here to the very bottom and you can hit host. And what this basically does is it passes all the instructions as you'd normally see on the processors directly through to the VM itself. So with some of the emulated ones like QEMU or KVM, there may be some things that aren't passed through from an extensions perspective, and the host direct host mapping allows you to see everything that you would normally see on the host processor. If you're in Proxmox, you would see on the VM as well. It's pretty helpful. We're not going to do anything with NUMA. I don't have a dual socket system in here, and I don't really want to do any tuning there. And the affinity, I'm going to keep pretty much default. What I am going to do, however, is I'm going to set the basic options here as we go through and make sure the performance is optimal for that VM. So in this case, I want to select the AES, which ensures you have AES instruction sets for hardware acceleration. And then I also want to enable 1 GB page sizes for the OS itself, because it will support that. Okay. Now, other options in here allows you to do things like Spectre meltdown mitigations if you're not doing a microcode update. But in most cases, you can do a microcode update and it'll cover most of those mitigations. But you can indeed tell it that the processor is patched or mitigated here. So the OS will, the Proxmox host itself will report the mitigations a little bit differently. So if we hit next, we're going to go ahead and select the amount of memory. In this case, we just want to do, let's just do 8096. We'll go ahead and next on that. And then for the network device, as I mentioned, I have this VMBR1, which is my trunk port. Now what that allowed me to do is pass a VLAN tag through that I want. In this case, it's going to be VLAN 88. And I want to go ahead and select the VirtIO para-virtualized driver. Now, this is important because this enables 10 gig performance as you install FreeBSD. Now, there is one deficiency that is very minor and it's very easily remedied, is when you install the para-virtualized network driver within BSD VirtIO driver, you want to go into the rc.conf after the install and turn off transmit and receive checksums, and then you also want to turn off TCP offloads, especially if you're running a routing device, and I'll talk about that in another session. And then over here, I'm not changing much here. Like, I'm going to keep my MTUs at 1500. I don't want to do jumbo frames here, which in this case would be 9,000. But I am going to go ahead and select multi-queue. Now, what you want to do, rule of thumb here, is you want 1 queue per processor that you essentially establish in the system. I'm going to do 2 here because, as you can see, I had 2 processors. And then I'm going to go to the next step, which is effectively finishing this. And then I'm going to select this that says start after created. We'll go ahead and finish that. And you'll notice here on the left-hand side, you will see the VM appear. I'm going to go ahead and open the console. And you can see it started the FreeBSD install. Go ahead and give it a second to load. All's looking good. We'll go ahead and select install. We'll select the default key map. We'll select the default host name here. Now this allows you to select the options that you want for as far as components in the install. I always go in and install ports and sources. Sources I just don't want to sync later. I'd rather do it now. And the ports tree is always important if you're installing anything from ports. And I'll go over that in another session. But these are the default options that I do enable. So if we go there, it's going to ask me next for the file system or partitioning scheme that I want in the disks. There's 2 different options here in BSD. There's the UFS file system, which is one that's been in the FreeBSD community for a very long period of time. Very simple, straightforward. Not a lot of customization options on it. You generally want to use ZFS now. 1, because it's well supported in BSD, and 2 is that it's got advanced options, like you can set up any type of software RAID. You know, it does RAID Z. You can do standard mirrors. You can set up caching devices that are associated with the ZFS pool that allow increased performance. You can adjust ARC cache. I mean, there's a bunch of different things that you can effectively do with it, but I always select ZFS. And one important thing to remember about ZFS is when you do this, ZFS does not like to be on top of RAID volumes, right? So when you install the FreeBSD VM, you want to make sure that you're putting it onto a Proxmox volume that is not using a hardware RAID backed volume. And the reason for that is it likes to see the raw disks, and it likes to know that the raw disk is there and interact with it directly. So make sure that when you're doing this, you set it up on either like another ZFS pool in Proxmox, or on a raw disk type setup, not a hardware RAID setup. All right, so in this case, we're going to go ahead and install with all the default options here. Okay, you can do things like adjust the swap size. You can do encrypted swap if you want. You can also mirror the swap if it's a highly available type of scenario. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and select a stripe, which says 0 disks, but you'll see in a second here that the stripe actually is a single disk that we're putting it on, but it treats it as a stripe because we're actually not doing a mirror, right? So if we select that, you'll see the single disk. We're going to go ahead and start the process of the installation. It's going to do checksum validation, and it's going to go through the archive extraction. This takes maybe a couple minutes. Okay, looking good. Now it's going to ask me for my default password. I'm going to put that in there. Okay, now it's going to ask for the network information. Okay, so in this case, like I said, I'm using a Proxmox bridge. I've got a tagged interface ID that's associated with that local interface assignment in the VM itself. So when I go in, the objective is it's going to use that tag that I associated with the VM. It's going to communicate on VLAN 88. It's going to contact the DHCP server, which has a listener on the 88 network, and then it's going to provide me with an address as a lease. So I'll select that. We'll go ahead and select, would you like IPv4? Yes. Would you like to configure a DHCP on this interface? Yes. And it'll go through and acquire the lease. Now, generally, that screen's critical because if you see that sit there for a while, that generally means that it's not having much success acquiring a DHCP address. If it's relatively quick like that, you'll notice it bounces to this IPv6. That generally means it got a IPv4 address properly. I'm not doing any IPv6 configurations on this VM, so we'll go ahead and say no there. And it's giving me my default domain for my lab. It's telling me what the default DNS address is in the lease. Everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and OK on that. Now I'm going to select my time and date region, the region, the time, and the date, right? So if I go down to United States of America, Eastern, we're going to select EST as the abbreviation. Times look good. Now I'm going to select the services that I want started at boot. You'll notice there's two that are enabled by default. One is the SSH daemon, which you want, and then there's also the dump dev, which I don't ever disable. The other options are you can set up your own local caching validating resolver through local onbound. That's desirable for some. In this case, it's just a simple test that I'm doing here to show how BSD is installed, so I'm not going to get too far into that. But I do want it to provide a network time service, and I do want it to sync that on start so clocks are consistent with the GPS time out there. Now, one nice thing about BSD is out of the box, it gives you hardening options. I love this because it's simple and it focuses on the things that are probably top of mind for people that are installing a new operating system. They want to make sure certain things are secured. This has got the options for everything you would kind of need right out of the box. But you can go in and configure a lot more of these through the rc.conf and throughout the system within syscontrols and stuff like that. In this case, I'm going to select all of them because there's nothing in here that impedes my ability to do anything. It just increases the overall security. Like I don't want temp files on system startup. I want it to clear that out. And then everything else as far as process IDs and everything else I want to hide. So we'll go ahead and select that, and then we're going to go ahead and add a user. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and create one for myself. Standard UID. Wheel as the login group. I want that to be elevated, and I want to be part of that wheel group. I'm going to go and select all these as default. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in a password here. And I'm going to go ahead and select yes, and I'm happy with that. I do not want to add another user. And that's it. We're pretty much done. At this point, you can go ahead and restart the operating system and do the final steps to make sure that it's ready to run in Proxmox. So we'll go ahead and exit this. We're not going to do any post-installation configurations here, so we'll say no. We're going to go ahead and reboot. Now at this time, we want to go into hardware, and we want to go ahead and dismount the ISO that we're using for the install. So I just did that. We're going to go back in, starting it back up. Let's make sure this installation worked and everything's going to boot fine. Looks good. I got my lease right there. Generating the RSA keys for SSH. Everything looks good. So let's go ahead and log in. All good there. I'm going to go ahead and elevate. And it looks like we're good. So if we do a uname-a, we'll notice here it shows FreeBSD release 14, and there's no P on that patch level. Okay, so one thing we want to do right out of the box is we want to make sure that FreeBSD is at its latest possible version. All the security updates are applied. Okay, that's done through FreeBSD update. Okay, it's a relatively easy process. You just type in FreeBSD update, and then we do fetch. And what that's going to do is it's going to go out and fetch any patches or security updates. It's going to inspect the current system configuration. It's going to compare that, and then it's going to go ahead and get everything ready so we can do the install. So give it just a second here. Depending on how old the release is, this can be relatively quick from a download perspective. If it hasn't been patched in a while, you can sit here for a while and kind of wait for it to go through all the download of the files. Now, one thing I like about the BSD update configuration and the tools they built is I've never, ever had a problem with this process. It always runs seamlessly. It's always smooth. This is very well built. Similarly, for the package configuration, and I'll go over that, very, very rarely do you have any type of conflicts or anything like that. It's extremely easy to use. And if you use things like Yum in the past, or traditional Linux package managers, you really kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and it's really refreshing when you start to use BSDs because it just works, and it works extremely well. All right, so it's download the patches, is now applying those. This can take a few moments. All right, that looks really good. So you can see here that it's fetched everything, and it's now showing FreeBSD 14.0 release P5. Okay, so if we go ahead and do a queue on that, it's going to show all of the individual files that it's updating. So we'll go down and press spacebar. We'll look at that. Just make sure everything's kind of looking good here. There's nothing that stands out. And then once it's done, we'll do a queue, and that'll exit. Okay, so the next step is we do an up arrow, and then we go ahead and change this to FreeBSD update install. This will install all of those updates. This process is usually relatively quick. Okay, everything looks good there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to update the package database. Okay, so we want to make sure that the current package database is up to standard. We'll do a package update, and it'll tell you here, do you want to fetch and install Say yes on that. Okay, everything looks good. So now package is updated, FreeBSD update is done, updates are installed. I'm now going to reboot the OS. Okay, it's restarting. Okay, that looks good. We're going to go ahead and log in. Elevate. Okay, all that looks good. Now we're going to do a uname space -a, and that's going to show us whether the release has been patched, and it looks like it is. So you can see here it's FreeBSD 14.0 release P5. Perfect. Everything's good to go. Now what we're going to do is we want that QEMU agent to work, and we want it running. Okay, so if we go in to the system, one really quick way of doing this, if you're not exactly sure which package it is, you can do a package search, and we'll just type in QEMU here. And right away, it brings back a list of packages. You can see here, there's one called the QEMU guest agent, and that's what we actually want to install. So we'll do package install, QEMU guest agent. Okay, and you can tell it shows what dependencies it has here, and then it's going to ask to install it. We're going to hit yes. It's going to install it, and then it usually gives us some information on how you'll actually start it, right? So you'll see here it shows the sysrc, which is the command you use to actually enter things into the rc.conf, which starts everything. So in this case, we'll do exactly like it says. We'll go ahead and type in sysrc QEMU guest agent enable equals. Type yes. QEMU guest agent looks good. Enable yes. Perfect. So that's it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a start. We're going to start that service. And in this case, you can see it's a little different. There's hyphens in there rather than underscores. So just keep that in mind. And now you'll notice that it says it started. Now, how do we verify that it's actually working and Proxmox is communicating with the agent? Very easily. We go up here, and then what we'll do is we'll go to summary, and you'll notice right here where it shows IPs, okay? When you see IPs here on this list and you see MAC addresses, that is an indicator that the agent is actually installed. If you do not have communication with the agent or something's not working or it's not installed, this will be blank and it will not work. Now, what's important about this, I might have mentioned previously, is you want this to be enabled and you want it to be running, because if you have to reboot the Proxmox host, it needs to communicate that agent to be able to do a graceful shutdown the BSD host. Otherwise, you might have a process where it'll hang, it'll kind of sit there and wait for the virtual machine to terminate through like a forced stop, and you don't really want that situation. So I always recommend the agent is actually installed. Okay, so in this case, we have standard FreeBSD. It's updated. Everything looks good. It's working with Proxmox. That kind of concludes the FreeBSD install, basic FreeBSD install. I'll produce some other videos that go over into some more advanced topics and some services within BSD that we can enable that work really well within this environment. But for now, that shows kind of how to do the basic install. Now, one thing before we close is I will show how to do a quick snapshot. And you can go in here, you can do take snapshot, and then you can put in whatever you want here. You can call it post install. and then you do include RAM, and that'll actually do full snap. So if you need to go back, you screw something up, you need to go back to a point in time, it's very easy to do. You select the snapshot, you roll it back. Now, another cool thing is if you have a standard FreeBSD install and you have everything done and you want to use it as a template for another install, obviously you don't want to have to reinstall FreeBSD. You just kind of bake everything in and then run that template. Simply right click here and then do a convert to template, okay? And when you do that, well, you have to stop it first. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now we'll go to convert to template. And when you do that, you'll see here that it's actually going to convert that operating system footprint into a template. And you'll see it show up down here as a template image. And then it's very simple to do. You just do a clone. You'll put in the name test2 at this point in time. We're going to do a link clone rather than a full clone, just so it uses that existing image. It's not doing a full clone of that entire, just for disk space purposes. And we do a clone there. Wait for it to finish. We'll see 103. We'll go to console. We're going to go start. There it is. No install, just a quick template clone, and you're pretty much ready to go. So that kind of concludes this. I'll have other videos I'm creating that go over more advanced topics, but this will at least get you started on a basic FreeBSD install within Proxmox. Thanks.